I Am Legend, across its many iterations, tells not only the story of a man alone in a ruined world, but also changes in the culture as the story transformed from its initial form, a novel by Richard Matheson published in 1954, and 3 film adaptations in the following decades. It's a fascinating view not only of the transformation of the vampire stories of classic horror into the zombie genre, but also the shifting relationship of the individual to the state. The 1954 book is set in Los Angeles during the late 70s, which can be a bit disorienting reading it now because it feels very 50s. It's a reimagining of the vampire genre, pulling the tropes out of the supernatural and into a more rationalist view. Garlic repels them because of an allergic reaction on a cellular level. They have to be staked because of the rapid coagulation in their soft tissue, acting to instantly seal up wounds that aren't propped open with something. Crosses repel vampires because of a psychological response in the remnants of their old minds, feeling themselves to be somehow responsible for their condition in a sin and punishment kind of way. Consequently, a crucifix only works on those who were Christian. What would a Mohammedan vampire do if faced with a cross? All of this is conveyed from the perspective of Robert Neville, a sort of everyman with just enough background established that we can place him in society. He works in a factory of some sort. He has a wife and daughter. He owns a house in the suburbs. He's not a doctor or a scientist. He's just a rational man. How was it that he always managed to hit the heart? It had to be the heart. Dr. Bush had said so. Yet he, Neville, had no anatomical knowledge. His brow furrowed. It irritated him that he should have gone through this hideous process so long without stopping once to question it. He shook his head. No, I should think it over carefully, he thought. I should collect all the questions before I try to answer them. Things should be done the right way, the scientific way. Robert, immune to the disease, believes himself to be the last survivor. By day, he roams around Los Angeles collecting supplies and exterminating sleeping vampires. At night, he drinks whiskey and tries to sleep while rowdy monsters gather around his house and attack his boarded-up windows and garlic-strung doors in a futile but disconcerting effort to get at him. And then one day, years into this apocalypse, he encounters a woman who tells a story that doesn't quite add up. It turns out that there are people who are infected with vampirism, but through a drug they've developed, they keep it under control. They don't turn, they don't feed on blood, they don't lose their higher mental faculties. They do, however, sleep during the day, and Robert has disposed of quite a few of them during his daily routine. This woman, Ruth, has been sent to spy on him and report back before they launch an attack to capture him. To them, he's the monster, a terrifying creature that roams during the day and kills them as they sleep. In 1964, it was adapted into a film titled The Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price. By far the most faithful adaptation, it still deviates from the book in some significant ways. Robert Neville, working-class everyman, is now replaced with Dr. Robert Morgan, a medical researcher. Why the name change? I don't know. But I find it interesting that in the book, Neville has no medical background, but he has access to the library. He studies medical texts and eventually learns enough to understand how the infection works. I take it as a comment on what the average guy is capable of if circumstances demand it. Turning the character into Dr. Morgan negates that. Instead of expanding his knowledge, he's continuing to do what he did before the plague, just with vastly reduced resources. But perhaps the most significant impact comes about simply through the change of medium. They still want his blood. He repels them with garlic. Sunlight is deadly to them, all classic vampire stuff. But when their reduced mental capacity is translated to the screen, they become a shambling mob of moaning undead, thump-dragging through the ruins of civilization. Last Man on Earth is a zombie film. George Romero cited it as a major influence on his own Night of the Living Dead. The Last Man on Earth is cinematic evolution in action. It's the transition between the singular personified adversary of the classic vampire stories and the relentless collective enemy of the zombie genre. Between the shambling mass of dumbass vampires and the organized clan of those infected but self-medicating, Robert is an oddity, an out-of-place relic of the old world. In both the book and this film, the infected survivors go after Robert, perceiving him as a threat. The broad strokes are the same, but in the book, once Robert realizes that he's been killing their people, living people, and he understands why they're coming for him, he decides that he'll let them take him and face this new society's justice. But he wasn't going to fight. He had worked out his decision very carefully. When they called to him, he would go out and surrender. It was his decision. But this new society of theirs is much less refined than he expects. But they didn't call. Neville lurched back with a gasp as the axe blade bit deeply into the front door. He stood trembling in the dark living room. What were they doing? Why didn't they call on him to surrender? He wasn't a vampire, he was a man like them. What were they doing? As it sinks into his middle-class American skull that there's not going to be a trial, just a butchering, he grabs a gun and prepares to defend himself. And the rest plays out like a scene from so many no-knock police raids over recent years. "He's got a gun," one of them cried and fired his pistol. Neville heard the bullet smash into the wall over his head. Then the pistol was jolting in his hand, splashing his face with bursts of light. He didn't fire at any one of them, he just kept pulling the trigger automatically. One of the men cried out in pain. Then Neville felt a violent club blow across his chest. He staggered back and jagged, burning pain exploded in his body. He fired once more, then crashed to his knees, the pistol slipping from his fingers. "You got him," he heard someone cry as he fell on his face. He tried to reach out for the pistol, but a dark boot stamped on his hand and broke it. Neville drew in his hand with a rattling gasp and stared through pain-glazed eyes at the floor. He passes out, and when he awakens, he's in a cell. Ruth comes to visit him as he awaits his execution. "Why did you fight them?" she said. "They had orders to bring you in unharmed. If you hadn't fired at them, they wouldn't have harmed you." "Well, Ruth, when goons shoot open your door in the middle of the night like some junta's death squad, you can't really blame people for assuming that that's what they are and responding accordingly." But having spent some time with him, Ruth decides that Robert isn't quite the monster she thought he was, and she slips him some poison so he can take his own life instead of being torn apart by his captors after some mockery of a trial. He warns her not to let the new society become too brutal. Last Man on Earth changes it up some, partly centered around Robert, now Dr. Robert Morgan, who is working on a cure. He's close to one, but the new society chases him into a church and kills him. It ends with the same somber tone of his death standing in for the death of the old world, making way for a new and more raw society to replace it. A society that isn't really more brutal than our own, but is more honest about it. And because Robert could have cured them if only they'd listened to him, it bakes a moral judgment on them into the narrative. Rather than just brutally pragmatic, now they're rash and throw away their chance for salvation. But it also begins the ongoing drift of credentializing the protagonist. In Matheson's book, Robert Neville is just a guy, a factory worker, commuting to the plant Monday through Friday. Last Man on Earth turns him into not only a medical researcher, but one specifically studying the vampirism plague, presumably with government backing. The next screen adaptation of the story, 1971's Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston, takes this a step further. Now Robert Neville is a colonel in the army as well as a doctor.
"This is the man, and I mean the man."
His immunity isn't the result of some natural fluke, but by injecting himself with a vaccine that he played a role in developing. His immunity being the result of intentional action rather than chance, is mirrored with the plague now being explicitly the result of biological warfare.
The very foundations of civilization are beginning to crumble under the dread assault of that horror long feared, germ warfare.
This was an idea only floated as a possibility in Last Man on Earth, while the book presents the vampirism infection as something natural that has been around for a very long time. Something black and of the night had come crawling out of the Middle Ages, something with no framework or credulity, something that had been consigned, fact and figure, to the pages of imaginative literature. A tenuous legend passed from century to century. Well, it was true. Oh, they knew it was something, but it couldn't be that, not that. That was imagination. That was superstition. There was no such thing as that. And before science had caught up with the legend had swallowed science and everything. The story has been gradually shifting toward a worldview centered on human action. What was once natural becomes manufactured. What was once unknown and unpredictable is transformed into deliberate planned action by human beings. The infected are also altered here. The slow-moving, mentally stunted, zombie-like creatures of the previous iterations are replaced by the family, a cult of infected primitivists that serve both the role of these shambling undead and the new society of the original story. They lean more into their vampire roots in this one, being essentially nocturnal humans. They're sick, they have visible lesions and sores, but they're not noticeably impaired. They can run and they can fight, they plan and have conversations. They use machines of increasing complexity despite their stated ideological opposition to them.
Murder, use of forbidden tools, practice of prescribed rites. He admits science, medicine, weapons, machinery, electricity.
Invoking the 2 World Wars exception, I suppose. Of course, the story structure requires some iteration of Ruth and her new society of people who are infected but not completely gone. In this instance, it's a woman, now named Lisa, and a group of kids living on the outskirts of Los Angeles. And rather than being chased down by Robert, she rescues him from a rather medieval execution in the middle of the movie. Rather than viewing Robert as a monster, they're natural allies. Both have a conflict with the family, both have an interest in finding a cure. Robert manages to synthesize one from his own blood, and in the end, after inevitably being mortally wounded in a battle with the infected, he sets aside a jar of the serum for the leader of this group, who conveniently had been a medical student before the plague, and they ride off into the hills the next morning, presumably to cure themselves and live as normal humans with mainstream Western values rather than a murderous cult. Notice how this ending has shifted from the book's fatalistic acceptance of the world changing. Robert's realization that it's changed so much that he's no longer the normal one. He's the monster to the new normal society. Like vampires were in his world, he has become the legend that will frighten future generations in the new world that's forming. In The Last Man on Earth, he never fully accepts the change. In Omega Man, the whole premise is rejected. The infected, the cult-like nocturnal family, are never fully normalized. They're still aberrations, and the future is placed on the kids and the cure that has been gifted to them by Robert Neville. Doctor, soldier, agent of the state. Bringing us to 2007 with I Am Legend, starring Will Smith. This time around, the plague is the result of a gene therapy treatment designed to cure cancer. It mutates, becomes airborne, and people become these mutants, playing off the whole fast zombies thing that was popular around that time. Building on Omega Man, Robert Neville is still an army officer, and not only a brilliant doctor, but a famous one, hailed as mankind's savior for his efforts to combat the infection. The hero has been completely transformed into an avatar of authority, while the everyman of the original story is only represented in the mob trying to flee Manhattan through health checkpoints manned by mask-wearing soldiers. Pro tip, if you're going to seal off Manhattan Island, don't announce it beforehand. While the book follows an average guy doing what he needs to, exceeding his own limitations and learning survival skills and medical science on his own, this most recent film adaptation heavily credentials Robert, making him hyper-competent, at least on paper, because in practice, he makes a lot of bonehead moves. Now, part of this could obviously be the stress of spending a couple years alone in New York with a bunch of hyper-athletic cannibals. Clearly, the man is not in the best mental state. And some of it is actually, intentionally or not, good commentary on some tendencies in our modern way of understanding the world and how we see things through the lens of our own scientific and political theories. For example, at one point he sets a snare to catch an infected specimen to test experimental treatments on. A member of that individual's nest reacts very strongly to this, clearly indicating a personal connection. Robert, in his research notes, refers to the incident this way.
Decreased brain function or growing scarcity of food is causing them to ignore their basic survival instincts.
To us, that behavior is obviously indicative of an emotional connection. But Dr. Neville missing that is actually a really good comment on something I've seen in academia over the years. Sometimes a highly educated specialist can become so locked into a particular model that they begin to interpret all their data within the confines of that model. For example, I will use Marxist economic analysis as much as anyone else in grad school, but I've known people that were unable to chuck it aside when class struggle or oppression Olympics didn't really apply to a given set of events. We see it particularly in fields with entrenched political interests intersecting them, like climate science, for example. And Dr. Neville here is a great representative of how it works. His prior research and experience indicates that infection severely damages cognitive function, turning people into vicious zombies driven solely by base instincts. So from inside his assumptions, it makes sense to conclude that this creature pushing out into the sunlight after him and only withdrawing when it starts to burn is indicative of dwindling food supplies on the island. But to anyone outside his assumptions, it's obvious that this dude is pissed that someone just abducted his girlfriend and he's ready to take extreme measures to get her back. This version of the story takes the basic premise of Neville being the monster to them and folds it into something a little more interesting from the original, where he was just methodically going through the city killing them day by day. But despite being the only film adaptation to keep the title, it's in many ways the least faithful to the source material and really misses the point, particularly with the ending used in the theatrical release. Ruth from the original story has been transformed from an instrument of a brutal new society into Anna, an uninfected survivor who saves Robert from his own grief-fueled idiocy and then transforms into the one that needs saving. These survivor groups she becomes part of are not a brutal eschatological cult, but just people that have walled off a little slice of middle America for themselves. Robert Neville is transformed from a monster that will live on in the New World's legends into a messianic figure, sacrificing himself that they might live.
We are his legacy. This is his legend.
I should note that this film was languishing in development for a long time. There's a script by Mark Protosevich from the 90s that is very much the transition point between Omega Man and this film, and it does some interesting things with the material that would have been great to see on screen. It's far too into the weeds to talk about that script in detail here, but I'll link it in the description if you're interested. Suffice it to say that the film we got seems to be the result of a lot of committee decisions. It even has an alternate ending where Robert releases his test subject to the vampires that assaulted his house, and they withdraw having gotten what they came for. He then travels with Anna to the new settlement and presumably all is well. This isn't really better in terms of the source material, but a lot of people prefer it as the ending for this particular movie. For me, it's kind of meh either way. The fact that they made two endings makes it clear that the filmmakers weren't really feeling it either. And of course, we have a different reaction watching that film today than audiences did at the time to some of the imagery. The story has changed in the telling over the last 70 years, and I think in some ways it mirrors how our society has changed. At its core, it's a story about a man acting rationally, doing what he believes is moral and correct, but being perceived as a vicious monster by other people who sincerely believe themselves to be right. It confronts us with a moral relativism that doesn't try to justify reprehensible behavior, but instead makes us question our assumptions, makes us ask ourselves if we're really as firmly in the right as we'd like to think. And as America has become the monster to much of the world and more paranoid and authoritarian here at home, that has become an increasingly difficult question to face. In Matheson's book and Last Man on Earth, the vampires can be kept back by hanging mirrors on the door. They're unable to look straight on at what they've become. I have to wonder if the multiple endings of Ot7's I Am Legend, both of them veering away from Robert Neville's self-revelation of his own monstrousness, are indicative of modern American society being unable to look itself in the mirror.
Mommy, they have guns!
It's okay, they're in the army like Daddy.